She walked into a luxury office building without shoes. No resume, no makeup, no connections. Just a quiet woman in a worn-out dress walking barefoot through judgment and marble floors. Who was she? Why would anyone come to a job interview like that? And why did the CEO of a $1 million company who had 50 polished candidates waiting choose her? This is not just a story about a secretary. It's about a woman who lost everything and still showed up. A mother fading away, a husband who never came home, a woman holding herself together with coffee-stained hope and whispered prayers. It's about how heartbreak leaves scars, but also how kindness finds its way through the cracks, and how sometimes the ones the world calls unqualified are the ones most equipped to lead with heart. So, why did she walk in barefoot that day, and how did that one step change everything? If you're ready for a story that will move your heart, warm your soul, and maybe even change the way you see people, share and subscribe to our channel, because this is a story you won't forget. The marble floor inside the lobby of Whitmore Interiors glistened under the mid-morning sun, catching reflections from the tall windows and refracting them like soft light through a prism. The room carried a hush of anticipation, the kind found only in places where appearances meant everything, and silence was part of the dress code. Women sat in a neat line of chairs, their legs crossed elegantly, resumes tucked into sleek leather folders. Their heels tapped the floor in measured rhythms, like a performance practiced 100 times before. The scent of perfume, expensive coffee, and quiet ambition hung in the air. Then the doors opened, she stepped in, no shoes. For a second, everything stopped. Claire Bennett didn't flinch as the coolness of the polished tile met the raw skin of her feet. Her steps were soft but steady, carrying her into the space like a question no one wanted to answer. Heads turned, some brows lifted. A few gasps broke through the thin veneer of professionalism. Claire knew what they saw. A woman in her 30s, too thin to be fashionable, too plain to be memorable. A faded dress, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and hair pulled back into a knot that had come loose during a long, hot walk. But it was the feet, bare, dusty, red around the edges from pavement heat and rough ground. The receptionist at the front desk blinked, her fingers hovering above her keyboard, like she wasn't sure if she should type something or press a silent alarm. Claire offered a small smile, not the kind that sought approval, but the kind a person learns to give when they've stopped expecting kindness. "I have an interview," she said, her voice calm and polite. Claire Bennett. The woman at the desk hesitated, glancing toward the uniformed guard nearby. Tony, the security guard, had been watching too, not judging, just unsure. He took a step forward, his hand resting gently on his belt. "Ma'am, this is a professional office. I'm not sure you're in the right. I sent in my resume." Claire interrupted, gently but firmly. "Last week, I was called in for an interview today at 10. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't plead. Behind her, someone whispered, not softly enough. A chuckle followed. Another woman pulled out her phone, not even bothering to hide it. Claire didn't look back. She just stood there, in front of the desk, her hands relaxed at her sides. Tony looked uncomfortable, not because she frightened him, but because she didn't. Because she stood there with so much dignity, it unsettled him more than if she had shouted. And then, from across the lobby, a door opened. Andrew Whitmore stepped out. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a navy blue shirt, sleeves rolled, and dark gray slacks. He didn't walk like someone used to commanding attention, but the room noticed him anyway. He paused near the elevator, eyes scanning the row of applicants, then shifting toward the lobby. His gaze landed on Claire. There was a flicker, recognition. He took a step closer. Everyone turned to look at him. He didn't seem to care. His voice came clear and firm. "Let her in." Tony straightened. Sir Andrew nodded, not breaking eye contact with Claire. "She's here for an interview. Let her in." The receptionist looked like she might melt into her chair. Claire blinked, not in disbelief, but as if bracing herself. "Thank you," she whispered. She moved past the rows of stairs and clicks and murmurs, past the women in pressed blazers and perfect makeup, past the invisible line between being judged and being allowed. She sat down in the last chair of the row, folding her hands neatly in her lap. No one said anything directly to her, but the air changed. A few glanced. One woman leaned closer to another and whispered something. Claire heard the word Barefoot and CEO. She stared ahead. Her heart was beating hard in her chest, but her face gave away nothing. The floor beneath her bare feet was cold, but solid. It grounded her. All she could think was, "You're here, that's enough." From the second floor, behind the glass rail, Andrew stood quietly and watched. He didn't smile. He didn't nod, but something in his eyes said he remembered more than he let on. Claire didn't know it yet, but today would not end the way she thought it would. It would change everything. They all thought she didn't belong, but no one knew what it took for her to show up at all. Claire had woken up that morning before the sun had. The sky outside the bedroom window was still dark, and the cicadas hummed like an old radio left on overnight. The sheets next to her were already cold. She sat up slowly, not from sleep, but from exhaustion, the kind that lives in the bones. Her hand instinctively reached toward the baby monitor sitting on her nightstand. Even though the baby on the other end was nearly 70, down the narrow hallway, a soft thump echoed, followed by the creak of the back door. Claire shot out of bed, heart pounding. She found her mother, June, in the backyard, barefoot in the dew-wet grass, standing still as a statue and staring up at the sky. "Mama," Claire whispered gently, wrapping an old sweater around her shoulders. "It's still dark. Let's get you back inside." June looked at her with wide, startled eyes. "Are you the nurse?" Claire smiled softly, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Just someone who loves you." She guided her mother back into the house, step by step, whispering calming words neither of them truly believed. She helped her use the bathroom, changed her, and sat her down in front of the small kitchen window with a bowl of lukewarm oatmeal she'd reheated for the third time this week. Her mother hummed an old hymn under her breath while Claire added cinnamon to the bowl. The spoon clinked gently against the ceramic. These were the kinds of mornings that stretched longer than they should and never felt long enough. By 6 aspires, ma'am. Claire had already cleaned the dishes, laid out her mother's pills in the same weekly box, and scrawled out a handwritten note for the visiting home aide. "Please remind her I love her. She may not know who I am, but I'm still her girl." She changed quickly in the bathroom, slipping into the same dress she wore for every important occasion, a simple navy blue cotton one, pressed as best as she could with a warm iron and hope. Her only pair of black flats sat beneath the sink. One of the straps had been stitched twice already. When she picked them up, the right strap came loose again, hanging like a threadbare promise. She stared at it, then reached for duct tape. Outside, the heat was already thick. The summer air in Georgia didn't wait for noon to turn cruel. She had borrowed her neighbor's car for the day, a dusty 2006 sedan that coughed to life with a grumble. Claire adjusted the mirrors, patted the dashboard as if to say thank you, and pulled out of the driveway. 15 minutes into the drive, the temperature gauge spiked. Then the steering wheel jerked, the engine sputtered, then gave up like a tired old man halfway through a sentence. Claire sat in silence, both hands still gripping the wheel. She was still 10 miles out. But the bus didn't run this early, and the only option left was her feet. She got out, closed the door gently behind her, slung the canvas bag over her shoulder, and started walking. 3 miles later, the sun was higher, her hair stuck to the back of her neck, sweat pooled at her lower back. The tape on her shoe gave out a mile after that. Then the other strap snapped. She stopped near a bus bench, looked down, and quietly took both shoes off. She folded them into her bag, took a deep breath, and kept going. The sidewalk was hot. She stepped quickly at first, thinking it might get easier. It didn't. But she didn't stop. Every step was a conversation in her head. One voice said, "Turn back. You'll embarrass yourself." Another replied, "You made it this far. Don't you dare." She thought of the oatmeal, the soft hymn. her mother's wide, confused eyes. She thought of how much of herself she had set aside to become what the world never noticed. And she thought of the job posting administrative assistant, strong organizational skills, empathy a plus. She had those things. She had all of them. So she walked. When the glass tower of Whitmore Interiors appeared on the horizon, it shimmered like something out of a world she wasn't born into. Clean lines, tall ceilings, a fountain out front that bubbled quietly while the city passed by. Claire paused just outside the revolving doors. She caught her reflection in the glass, hair damp, dress creased, face flushed, feet bare. Then she heard a laugh inside, a light one. Probably nothing, but it shook her. She turned, looked back at the street. She could leave. No one knew she came. But then, behind the laughter, she heard something else, a voice in her memory. You were never made to disappear. She pressed her hand to the glass and stepped inside. Every inch of the floor chilled her skin, but she stood tall. The security guard's voice blurred. She answered calmly, her name, her appointment, her reason for being there. And then, that man, that voice. Let her in. She walked past the stairs, the whispers, the clicking phones, sat down at the end of the row like she'd earned it. Her hands trembled in her lap, but her back remained straight. Her eyes were steady. Let them laugh. She hadn't come to impress. She'd come to survive. They all looked perfect. She looked like she didn't even belong to the same world. Claire sat at the end of the row, her canvas bag tucked neatly at her feet. Around her, the air buzzed with soft perfume and quiet superiority. The walls gleamed like they'd been scrubbed clean of imperfection. The floor was so spotless she could see the reflection of $20 lipstick smiles. Every woman in the room looked like she had been born knowing how to sit properly in a pencil skirt. They crossed their legs effortlessly, their heels shining under the track lighting like polished silver. Manicured fingers scrolled through phones or adjusted silk scarves. Laughter fluttered in soft bursts, controlled, pleasant, expensive. Claire kept her hands in her lap, fingers intertwined, hiding the tiny tremble in her knuckles. Her bare feet rested lightly against the cool tile. She had tried not to notice how many eyes had trailed down toward them, how quickly they turned away like they'd seen something indecent. The woman beside her was young, maybe early 20s. Her hair was perfect. Her nails painted a color called rose ambition, or something close to that. Claire could smell the shampoo from where she sat. "Are you here to clean?" the girl asked, not unkindly, just confused. "Or to interview?" Claire smiled, not big, just enough. She didn't answer. Some questions weren't meant to be met with words. The girl blushed and looked back at her phone. Across the room, a tall brunette whispered something behind her hand. Another woman smirked in response. Claire didn't hear the words, but she felt the intent. It settled over her skin like static. A staff member walked in, a young man in a crisp gray vest and name badge that read Jordan. He carried a clipboard and wore an earpiece, as though conducting something far more urgent than a corporate interview. "We'll be calling candidates in order of arrival," he announced. "Please listen for your name." The women straightened in their seats, resumes poised like shields. Names were called, one by one. Women rose, smoothed their skirts, clicked confidently across the floor, and disappeared through the side door that led to the elevator. Claire remained still. No one called her name. 10 minutes, 15, 30. The sun shifted slightly in the windows, casting long bars of light across the floor. Claire folded and unfolded the edge of her folder, not enough to damage it, just enough to keep her hands from trembling. Behind her, another whisper, "Barefoot girls still here." A laugh followed, not loud, but sharp enough to leave a mark. She didn't turn around. Upstairs, Andrew Whitmore sat at a long walnut desk in his glass-walled office. The city sprawled behind him in orderly chaos buildings, cars, trees, and people who would never know what was happening inside this room. He flipped through resumes with the same detachment he used to review product proposals. Clean formatting, Ivy League degrees, Buzzwords like results-driven and multitasker, all polished the same. Then he came to hers, Claire Bennett. Her resume was different. The formatting was plain, the font default. But something made him pause. Underwork history. She had written personal caregiver, 2019 to present. Took care of Alzheimer's patient with full-time responsibilities, including meal prep, medication tracking, emotional support, and safety monitoring. No company name, just that. Under skills. She had listed conflict resolution, multitasking, under pressure, empathetic listening, long-term scheduling. No buzzwords, just life. Andrew leaned back in his chair. He closed the folder and looked out the window, remembering the look on her face in the lobby, calm, tired, fearless. Back downstairs, Jordan returned with the clipboard. "We're ready for the last candidate," he said, eyes scanning the row. Claire Bennett. Claire stood, slowly, carefully. Her legs had stiffened from sitting too long. She smoothed the front of her dress. Not that it helped much. The creases were lived in, like everything else about her. She picked up her folder. Her hands no longer shook, not from fear, just from the weight of too much held in for too long. She took one step forward, behind her. Someone let out a short laugh. Another woman whispered, "Good luck, Barefoot Barbie." Claire didn't stop. She walked past them like a woman who had already survived more than their words could ever reach. At the elevator, Jordan smiled politely and held the door. "You're up?" She nodded. The doors closed. She looked at her reflection in the mirrored walls. Sweat along her temple, hair slightly frizzy from the walk, feet bare, skin pink from sun. She didn't look like anyone else in that room, but she looked like someone who had shown up. As the elevator ascended, she took a breath, then another. When the doors opened, she stepped out onto the executive floor with quiet certainty. She paused for just a moment before knocking, and in her mind, she repeated the words that had carried her across cracked sidewalks and cruel stairs. "My name is Claire Bennett, and I'm not here by accident." He'd seen hundreds of resumes, but hers was the only one handwritten, with coffee stains and a heart. Andrew Whitmore had a system. Every week, his assistant filtered the resumes, sorting them by keywords, GPA, formatting, and whatever algorithm the world now called qualified. The polished ones made it to his desk. The rest, he never saw. But 3 days ago, something slipped through the cracks. Or maybe he let it. The email was almost empty. No attachment. No LinkedIn link. Just a few plain lines typed in the body of the message. "My name is Claire Bennett. I don't have a formal resume. I've spent the last 4 years taking care of my mother, who has Alzheimer's. I've managed medication, appointments, late-night episodes, and full-time care. If loyalty, timing, empathy, and not giving up are considered skills, then I'm not unqualified. I'd like to try. Just once. If not here, then nowhere." He read it once, then again. He was supposed to delete it. That's what his mind told him. But something about those words unpolished, untrained, unafraid felt like a stone dropped into still water. Because he had known that world. His own mother, Ellen Whitmore, had slipped away over the course of 5 years. Not suddenly, but piece by piece, until the woman who once quoted Emily Dickinson over breakfast could no longer tie her shoes or recognize her son. Andrew remembered the mornings she mistook him for his father, the evenings when she cried for a sister who had died 40 years ago. He remembered the last time she said his name, and how it broke him more than when she stopped speaking altogether. He had hired nurses. He had the best care money could buy. But even with all that, there were nights when he sat at her bedside and felt useless, small, like a little boy with a Band-Aid trying to fix a flood. That's why Claire's words felt different, not crafted, not calculated, true. So, when he saw her step into the lobby that morning, barefoot, dress clinging slightly from the heat, head held just high enough to stay standing, he knew. It was her. He hadn't expected it. In truth, he hadn't expected her to show up at all. But there she was, and somehow, She looked even braver than her email. Later that morning, when she stepped into his office, she didn't scan the space like others had, searching for designer cues, status symbols. She looked at him. Only him. She didn't sit until he nodded. No resume, no portfolio, just a manila folder and a quiet kind of dignity. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked. She nodded. "To be considered." He leaned forward. "Why didn't you send a resume? I didn't think it would tell you anything worth knowing." She answered. He smiled, not fully but enough. They sat in silence for a beat. Outside, the hum of the city moved on, unaware that something different was unfolding inside these glass walls. Then he asked it, the question she probably expected least. "Why did you come barefoot?" Claire didn't blink, didn't stutter. "Because I wasn't going to let a broken strap stop me." It wasn't said like a joke. It wasn't dramatized. It was just the truth. Andrew leaned back. He wasn't someone easily impressed. In fact, he hated being impressed. It felt transactional. But this wasn't that. It was human. For a moment, he saw not just Claire, but the echo of every caregiver who had ever stood in a kitchen at 3A. Heating soup for someone who'd forgotten their own name? "I don't usually do this," he said. Finally. He picked up the phone and dialed his assistant. "Schedule Claire Bennett for a trial week," he said, "starting Monday." He didn't look at her as he said it. He didn't need to. She didn't react much, no smile, no gasp, just a slow breath, a subtle shift in her shoulders, like a soldier who had made it past the trench. When she stood, she thanked him quietly. She didn't ask about salary, didn't mention references. She just said, "I'll be here." And then she was gone. The door closed softly behind her. Andrew sat for a moment longer, eyes drifting toward the framed photo on his desk. His mother, young, holding him at 5 years old, both smiling. He traced the frame with his finger. "I think you'd have liked her," he whispered. She had no experience with spreadsheets, but she brought fresh coffee to the janitor every morning. Claire arrived early, always early, not to impress, but to prepare. She needed time to settle her nerves, to remind herself she deserved to be there, even when everything in the room said otherwise. Her desk sat near the window at the far end of the floor, not quite with the executives, but not with the temps either. A liminal space where newcomers either rose or vanished. On her first day, she spent 5 minutes trying to figure out how to turn on the office computer. The login screen blinked like it was judging her. When she finally made it past, she opened Excel and stared at it like a foreign language. She clicked something and the formatting vanished. Claire closed the window quietly, heart racing, but she didn't cry. She took out a notebook, hand-labeled each task she didn't understand, and promised herself she'd learn one new thing each day. She made mistakes, small ones, printed to the wrong copier, filed the vendor invoices in reverse order, misspelled procurement in a mass email. But she apologized quickly, and meant it. She didn't blame the system or her past, just took responsibility, asked questions, listened hard, and improved. Every morning, she brought 2 coffees, one for herself and one for Eddie, the janitor who started his shift an hour before the others arrived. "Black, no sugar," she'd say, handing it to him with a soft smile. "Just how you like it." She remembered people's names, their birthdays, who had a sick kid at home. To most, those things were small. To Claire, they were everything. Across the floor, behind glass walls and polished desks. Andrew Whitmore noticed, not loudly, not obviously, but in the way his eyes followed her briefly during meetings, in the way he asked someone to forward her a memo, even when she wasn't required to be on the thread. He never said anything to her, never praised or commented, but once, during a lunch break, he passed her desk and paused. His eyes landed on the small photo she had taped to the edge of her monitor. Her mother, June, laughing in a garden chair. He didn't say a word, just looked for a beat longer than necessary, then walked away. Claire noticed too, the quiet pauses, the way his shoulders softened, if only slightly, when their paths crossed in the hallway. But she didn't read into it. She couldn't afford to. Instead, she focused on the little things, straightening the supply closet, fixing the paper jam no one else bothered with, saying thank you, even to the courier who always forgot her name. But not everyone appreciated the way she moved through the office. Karen Mayfield, the operations manager, had been with Whitmore Interiors for 7 years. She ran her department like a private kingdom, and she noticed everything. She noticed how Andrew looked at Claire, how his voice softened by a fraction when her name was mentioned, and she didn't like it. Karen had clawed her way up no favors, no shortcuts. She'd played by the rules, worn the heels, smiled through dismissals. And now, here was this woman, barefoot, unqualified, out of place gaining attention without trying. It unsettled her. She began to ask questions cloaked in concern. Is Claire keeping up with the filing system? Has she been trained on our procurement software? Are we sure she understands client confidentiality? No accusations, just seeds, quiet, pointed seeds. Claire kept her head down, until one afternoon, when the storm broke, a delivery had been delayed custom fabric samples for a high-end client project, scheduled to launch that Friday. The design team panicked, calls flew, deadlines loomed. But Claire, who had been listening, remembered something. The delivery driver, Marcus, had mentioned during lunch break 2 days earlier that his cousin worked in the courier warehouse, a cousin who owed him a favor. While everyone scrambled, Claire stepped away and made a quiet call, then waited. 2 hours later, the samples arrived, intact, on time. The design lead was shocked. How did you? Claire just shrugged. Sometimes, it's about knowing who to ask. Word reached Andrew. He listened, said nothing. But later, when his assistant asked about the quarterly meeting, he said with the faintest smile, "Let's keep Claire in the loop. She might surprise us again." And she would have been proud to know that. But at her desk, Claire sat quietly, sipping tea from a chipped mug, unaware of the quiet shift her presence was beginning to make. She looked out the window, saw the sky growing dark with late summer clouds. A storm was coming. And Karen Mayfield was already writing her next email. It came at 3:17 a.m., no subject, just a photo and one line. "This is your secretary." Claire woke to the sound of her phone vibrating softly on the nightstand. For a moment, she thought it was part of her dream, something about missed buses and broken clocks. But the screen was lit, casting a dim glow across the room. She picked it up and squinted. Unknown sender, no subject. She tapped it open. There, frozen in low hallway light, was a photo. She was smiling, just barely standing next to Andrew outside the conference room. He wasn't touching her. They weren't even looking at each other directly. But her expression, it looked like trust, like gratitude, like something someone could twist if they wanted to. And someone did. She stared at the message for a long time, then set the phone down and got out of bed. She didn't sleep again. By 9:00 a.m., the building buzzed with a different kind of energy. Not the usual rush of phones ringing and heels clicking. This was quieter, sharper. Eyes followed her. Conversation stopped when she entered a room. Even Eddie, the janitor, gave her a hesitant smile and a slow, "Hey," as if unsure if friendliness would now be considered taking sides. She nodded back and kept walking. At 10:15, her name was called to a meeting. She didn't ask why. She already knew. Inside the glass-walled conference room, the air felt tight. 5 people she barely knew sat around the table, papers in front of them like shields. Karen sat at the head, a legal pad on her lap, pen poised like a blade. "We've received a concern," she began, her tone smooth, about conduct, about perceptions. Claire said nothing. Karen slid a copy of the photo across the table. "Is there something you'd like to explain?" The room was silent. Claire looked at the image, at her own smile, now reprinted like evidence. She could have explained. She could have said it was just a moment in a hallway, just a word of thanks, just human. But she didn't, because it wouldn't matter. not to people who had already made up their minds. "I have nothing to hide," she said, voice steady, "and nothing to add." Karen's mouth twitched into something between a smirk and a frown. "Noted. Somewhere behind the glass." Andrew stood still, staring into the skyline as the city kept moving. He had received the same photo, the same message, from the same shadow that didn't dare sign a name. Later that morning, he walked into a leadership meeting. They didn't greet him, just nodded, stiffly. Someone cleared their throat. "Andrew, your involvement with the new hire is becoming distracting." He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, picked up his coffee, and left the room without a word. Claire typed her resignation at 12:42 p.m., but it didn't feel right. So she tore the paper in half, then reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a note card, the same kind she used to leave reminders for her mother. She wrote slowly, carefully, folded the card, and walked to the front desk. She handed it to the receptionist with a small smile. "For Mr. Whitmore," then turned and walked out the door for the last time. The bus ride home was quiet. Claire sat by the window, head leaning gently against the glass. Her reflection looked older today. Not tired, not defeated, just emptied, somewhere near the third stop. A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall like a truth that didn't need hiding. This was the first time she had cried, not since her husband passed, not since the funeral, the casseroles, the silence that came after everyone stopped checking in. She had been strong for too long, and now, on a rumbling city bus, next to a stranger listening to music too loud, she finally let herself feel it all. At 6:10 p.m., Andrew returned to his office. He found the note waiting on his desk. No envelope, no signature, just the neat curve of her handwriting across cream-colored paper. He unfolded it. There were only a few lines. "Thank you for seeing me. Even when I was invisible, I know I didn't belong here. But for a few days, I felt like maybe I could. That meant more than I can say." He read it twice, then set it down carefully, like something fragile. Outside, the sky cracked open with distant thunder. The house smelled like boiled oatmeal and old quilts. But it was home, and it was all she had left. Claire stepped off the last Greyhound bus just after noon, her canvas bag thumping softly against her hip. The air in Elm Spring, Arkansas, was quieter than she remembered, thicker somehow, as if it, too, had stopped asking questions. She walked the half-mile from the station to her mother's house, a small wooden place with flaking blue shutters and a porch swing that groaned with every breeze. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The front door stuck like always, and she had to put her shoulder into it. The familiar scent hit her all at once: boiled oatmeal, wood polish, something faintly sweet like laundry detergent and thyme. "Mama," she called gently, stepping inside. June sat at the kitchen table, staring at a spoon. A bowl of oatmeal sat untouched in front of her, already congealing at the edges. Claire dropped her bag and moved toward her, trying to summon a smile. Her mother looked up slowly, blinking, tilting her head. "Where's Claire?" she asked. The words were like a slow bruise blooming in her chest. Claire crouched beside her, resting a hand on her mother's knee. "She's just here," she whispered, brushing a strand of silver hair back from June's forehead. "She's always here." June nodded absently, as if she'd only asked where the sugar was. Claire stood and turned away quickly, wiping at her face before the tears could fall. Then she moved into routine, turning the stove on low, reheating a new bowl of oatmeal, testing the texture with the back of a spoon. She stirred in a dash of cinnamon, just the way her mother used to, for her when she was small. Her hands trembled slightly. Fatigue, emotion. She couldn't tell. Maybe both. She placed the warm bowl in front of June and kissed the top of her head. "Try this one. Mama, it's better." June smiled, as if tasting a memory instead of food. Outside, the porch swing creaked again. That afternoon, Mrs. Henderson from next door came by, holding a pie in both hands. "Saw your lights on," she said with a kind smile. "Didn't expect you back so soon. Thought you had an interview out of state." Claire accepted the pie and smiled back, soft but brief. "Didn't work out," she said. "Wasn't a good fit." Mrs. Henderson nodded like she understood. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. Claire thanked her and shut the door quietly. That evening, after her mother had been changed, bathed, and tucked into bed, Claire sat at the kitchen table in the dim glow of the overhead light. She opened her old journal. The pages were worn, the spine tired. She hadn't written in weeks, maybe longer. She picked up a pen and stared at the paper for a long while before writing, "I was seen." That's enough for a lifetime. She didn't know if it was true, but writing it helped her pretend. She flipped to the next page and paused. Folded in between the pages was an old photo her and her husband, Daniel, standing in front of this very house 5 years ago. She in a sundress, he with paint on his shirt. They had just finished repainting the shutters that summer. They'd laughed about the color blueberry mist. She said it sounded like a candle. He said it sounded like a bad cocktail. She stared at his face for a long time, the kindness in it, the way he always looked at her like she was something good. She touched his smile with the tip of her finger. Later that night, Claire lay in the twin bed next to her mother's, their heads facing opposite directions like bookends. June had fallen asleep quickly, her breath shallow but even. Claire stared at the ceiling, the glow of the nightlight painting soft golden halos on the walls. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "I thought I could do something different. I thought I could be more." June stirred slightly, murmured something unintelligible, then quieted. Claire turned onto her side, facing her mother. "I left because I needed something that didn't smell like pills and boiled linens. I needed to remember I'm still a woman, still alive." She closed her eyes, but it was just a dream. Wasn't it? I flew too close. She tucked the blanket around her mother's shoulder gently. "I won't leave again, I promise." Outside, the rain began softly, first just a whisper, brushing the shingles and the porch swing like fingers on a piano, then a little steadier, rhythmic, like the house itself was exhaling, and miles away, in a very different kind of quiet, Andrew Whitmore sat alone in his office. The lights were off, except for the desk lamp. Her note was in front of him again, creased now from too many readings, but not torn. He read the final line once more. "Thank you for seeing me, even when I was invisible." He folded it back with care, and this time he didn't put it away. He kept it open, on his desk, where it could breathe. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just drove, east, then north, until the city noise faded behind him. Andrew left his penthouse at 6:12 a.m. The streets of Atlanta were just beginning to stir, headlights flickering across wet pavement, coffee shops unlocking their doors. He wore no suit, just jeans, a jacket, and the silence that had wrapped itself around him like a second skin. His assistant had texted twice before he reached the freeway. "Board meeting at 10. Need final sign-off on the Daniels account?" He didn't reply. He just drove. The highway stretched ahead in long, gray ribbons, slick from last night's rain. The car interior smelled faintly of leather and peppermint gum. The radio murmured in low tones, classical piano, barely audible under the steady hum of tires on asphalt. His thoughts didn't rush. They didn't even arrive. They floated, disjointed and muted, like snowflakes that never touched the ground. Somewhere near the South Carolina line, he reached into the glove box and pulled out a folded piece of fabric, a handkerchief, frayed at the edges, pale blue, with tiny embroidered initials, E. W. Ellen Whitmore, his mother. She had held on to that handkerchief in her final days, clutching it in trembling fingers when she could no longer find words. It had been her last anchor to something soft, something known. He carried it with him now, not for luck, but for weight. Hours passed. The signs on the road changed from city names to county roads to little green arrows pointing toward towns that barely made the map. He followed them anyway. By early afternoon, the scenery grew quieter. Fields, farmhouses, rusted mailboxes leaning at odd angles. He wasn't sure what road he turned down last. He only knew he had read it somewhere in her email, a sentence tossed between memories and quiet confessions. I live in a town so small the grocery store closes by 6. The only thing louder than the crickets is my mother calling my name when she forgets she already has. And then, somehow, the house was just there. Blue shutters, weathered porch. A swing swaying slowly even though the air was still. He pulled over across the street and killed the engine. The silence hit hard. For a full minute, he didn't move. He stared at the house, hands gripping the steering wheel like it could still take him somewhere else, somewhere easier. The front steps were damp from the earlier rain, mud gathered at the edge of the grass, and his shoes sank slightly as he crossed. He paused at the foot of the porch, looked up. There were wind chimes hanging under the awning, but they didn't make a sound. Everything felt waiting. He raised a hand to knock, but the door opened before he could. Claire stood there, barefoot, in an oversized wool sweater, sleeves pushed up. One hand held a spoon, the other still gripped the doorknob. She didn't speak, neither did he. For several seconds, the world held its breath. Rain dripped softly from the edge of the roof. Somewhere behind her, a kettle whistled. Her eyes searched his face not with anger, not with expectation, just a quiet kind of wondering, like she wasn't sure if he was real. Andrew didn't step forward. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out the handkerchief. He held it out gently. "She used to hold this," he said, voice low, when words didn't work anymore. Claire looked at the cloth for a long time, then slowly reached out, taking it like something sacred. She didn't smile, didn't cry, but her hand brushed his as she took it, and that 1 second of touch said more than either of them could. They stood like that for another moment, two people, soaked in quiet, standing between what was and what might still be, and behind them, inside the house. June called out faintly, "Claire, are you home?" Claire glanced over her shoulder, then back at him. "I have to." He nodded. "Of course." She stepped back. The door began to close, but not all the way. Not yet. They sat on the porch, like two broken people who'd forgotten how to speak. The rain had eased into a quiet drizzle, gentle enough to soften the edges of the world. Everything looked washed and waiting like the afternoon had pressed pause just for them. Claire brought out a chipped mug filled with lukewarm coffee. She handed it to Andrew, then sat down beside him on the swing, leaving just enough space for comfort. But not too much. They didn't look at each other at first, just stared out into the yard, where raindrops clung to the fence wire like tiny glass beads. Inside, June slept in her recliner, her breathing steady. The house was still quiet in the way that only old homes can be, where every sound is softened by memory. Andrew took a sip of coffee. It had gone bitter with time, but neither of them seemed to mind. They didn't speak for several minutes. There was nothing pressing, no polite conversation to fill the air. Just the sound of rain on the roof, the creak of the swing beneath them, and the weight of unspoken things beginning to settle. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "She used to grow sunflowers out there," she said softly, nodding toward the side of the yard. "When I was little, I thought they were magic, always facing the sun, like they knew something we didn't." Andrew followed her gaze. "I remember my mother planting peonies," he said. "She hated roses, said they were showy and full of themselves." Claire let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Sounds like she had opinions." He nodded, smiling faintly. Plenty, especially when her memory started slipping. She forgot who the president was, but remembered how much she hated roses. Claire pulled her knees up onto the swing, wrapping her arms around them, Her sweater sleeves fell past her wrists, and she absent-mindedly traced a fraying seam with her thumb. Was it sudden, she asked? No, he said. Slow, cruel, like someone turning the lights off in every room, one by one. Claire closed her eyes. That's exactly what it's like. Another pause. Another shared silence that didn't need filling. Andrew glanced at her hands, how steady they seemed now, though he imagined how often they must have shaken when no one was looking. I didn't know, he said quietly. About your husband. Claire didn't answer right away. The rain had almost stopped, just the occasional drop falling from the gutter above. It was a car accident, she said at last. 2 years ago in October. He went out for milk, never came back. She looked down at her feet, toes curled into the wood grain of the porch floor. They called it a freak collision. Wrong place, wrong second. I waited at the window for hours thinking he'd just forgotten his phone. Andrew didn't speak. His hand rested on his knee, still, but his fingers twitched slightly. I was angry at the world for a while, she continued, at everyone who kept living like nothing had shattered, but mostly, I was angry at myself for needing him so much. She paused. The next words came like a slow exhale. When Mama's symptoms worsened, I moved back in. It wasn't a noble decision. It was just what was left. Andrew's eyes stayed on the yard, but his voice was steady. You didn't have to explain. Claire shook her head. I wanted to, because when I walked into your building that day barefoot, overwhelmed, I wasn't just desperate for a job. She turned to him now, her gaze clear but heavy. I didn't want pity. I just wanted to be seen as someone still worth something. The words hung in the air like smoke from a match, fragile, brave. Andrew looked at her for a long moment. Then, finally, he answered, not with an explanation, not with reassurances, just a simple truth. You are... It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't followed by music or some swell of emotional fanfare. It was quiet, solid, real. Claire looked away quickly, blinking fast, as if unsure whether she wanted tears to come or stay put. The porch creaked again as the swing moved just slightly. A breeze passed through, cool and clean. The rain had stopped. A single bird chirped from the trees. Then another answered. Claire placed the mug down on the porch floor, still half full. She leaned back slightly, her shoulders relaxing in a way they hadn't for months. I didn't expect you to come, she said. Andrew smiled, not with his mouth, but with his whole expression, softened like worn linen. I didn't either. For a while, they just sat there. No company but the breeze, the drying earth, and the quiet knowledge that something lost had been, if not found, at least noticed. And in some broken, beautiful way. That was enough for now. She came back, not because she had to, but because someone believed she could. The sun had only just risen when Claire stood once again in the marble lobby of Whitmore Interiors. But this time, her feet were not bare. Her heels were modest, scuffed at the edges, second-hand, but whole. She stood a little taller, not out of pride, but because the weight on her shoulders had shifted, no longer the weight of survival. Now it was something steadier, something like becoming. At the reception desk, the same young woman looked up. She blinked in recognition, then smiled, tentative, genuine. Welcome back, Ms. Bennett. Claire returned the smile. Thank you. The elevator ride was silent, just like the first time. But this time, no one stared, no one whispered. And when the doors opened, she stepped out into a hallway that remembered her differently. The walls hadn't changed. The artwork was still too modern, the air too cold. But the people looked at her now with something else in their eyes. Not pity, not suspicion, respect. Andrew had offered her the new role with few words. A quiet meeting at the kitchen table back in Elm Spring, where he simply said, I need someone I can trust. Will you come back? She had said yes before thinking too hard. Because for once, her heart had spoken louder than her fears. Now, Her new desk sat just outside Andrew's office, a view of the skyline, a nameplate with her full name, a key to the supply closet she used to be afraid to ask for. As she settled into her chair, she noticed a small envelope waiting beside the monitor, her name written in Andrew's handwriting. Inside was a single sentence. "You don't have to prove yourself anymore." Claire closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle into her chest like warmth on a winter morning. By the end of her first week, the whispers had faded, not out of fear, but out of realization. She wasn't here by accident. She belonged. Karen, of course, was gone. The anonymous email had been traced. It had uncovered a trail even the careful ones forget to cover. There was no confrontation, no public scandal, just a resignation letter and a cleared-out office before lunch. No one spoke much about it. Claire didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. Some endings didn't require words, just doors that closed softly behind those who'd misused their power. The space Karen had left behind was quiet. No one seemed to miss her daily critiques or her clipboard that clicked like a metronome. In the silence she left, something better began to grow. One afternoon, as Claire refilled her water bottle in the break room, a woman from accounting walked in. The same woman who, weeks ago, had smirked and whispered to a colleague when Claire arrived barefoot. Now, she paused at the doorway, looked uncomfortable. She started. "I just wanted to say, I was wrong about you." Claire turned, expression calm. The woman's voice dropped. "I thought you were something else? Someone trying to cheat the system. But I was wrong." There was no dramatic apology, no teary scene, just a few words, quiet and trembling, and a look in her eyes that Claire recognized. Fear, regret. The ache of not knowing how to fix something you never meant to break. Claire smiled gently. "It's okay," she said. "We all learn." And that was enough. Later that evening, as most of the office lights dimmed, Claire stood at her window. The skyline sparkled in the dusk, reflections of a world that never really paused, but sometimes, just sometimes, allowed people to begin again. She thought about her mother, likely napping now with a blanket around her knees. She thought about her late husband, and how he'd once told her, "You've got the kind of strength that shows up quiet, like morning light." She had never understood it until now. Andrew passed behind her, heading out for the night. He paused briefly. "Good first week?" he asked. She turned, nodding. "Better than I expected." He smiled, then left without another word. Claire stood for a moment longer, letting the quiet fill her not with loneliness, but with peace. Because this time, she hadn't come back to prove herself. She had come back whole. The garden behind the office had always been empty. That day, it bloomed with fairy lights and quiet hope. Claire didn't notice it at first. The gathering was small, just a company-wide thank you celebration, marking the end of a long quarter. Folding tables lined with sandwiches and soft music from a Bluetooth speaker tucked behind the reception desk. People laughing over paper plates. Office politics set aside for one mild spring afternoon. It wasn't anything grand, but it felt genuine. Claire had spent the last hour flitting between conversations, surface-level talk about weekend plans, new projects, the weather turning warm. She laughed, she smiled, she meant it. When Andrew tapped her shoulder gently and gestured toward the back patio, she didn't hesitate. Something in his eyes said, this wasn't just a walk for air. He led her through the side door, past the rows of cubicles and out into the courtyard where, for years, weeds had outnumbered flowers and no one had paid it much attention. But not today. Today, the garden had changed. Soft fairy lights had been strung from branch to branch low, warm, humming gently in the early evening breeze. A narrow stone path had been cleared, winding past small wooden benches, planter beds filled with blooming peonies, and wind chimes that whispered with each movement of air. Claire stopped walking. She looked around slowly, eyes wide, as if trying not to blink in case it all vanished. "I don't understand," she began. Andrew's voice was quiet. This was my mother's favorite place. Claire turned to face him. She used to sit right there. He nodded toward the far bench beneath a crabapple tree, even when she forgot where she was. She always remembered this garden. Claire felt something catch in her chest. I wanted to restore it, he said, but not for her, not anymore, for someone else who makes quiet spaces feel alive again. She didn't know what to say. Her eyes moved from the lights to the flowers, to the way the sky had started turning soft pink above the rooftop line. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a small, worn box. Not velvet, not gold, just a simple square of aged leather, faded at the corners. He held it out, and when she opened it, there lay a single ring. It was delicate, no diamond, no shine, just a band of smooth silver with one small etching along the inside curve. Claire ran her fingertip over it slowly. A single letter, E. She gave it to me the year before she forgot my name, Andrew said, voice steady but quiet. Said I'd know when to pass it on. Claire looked up at him. His eyes held hers without flinching, but there was no pressure, no expectation, only honesty. I don't want a story that starts perfect, he said. I want a story that's real, one that's walked through fire, one that understands silence and waiting and small, soft things that grow anyway. He took a slow breath. I want to build a life with someone who walks barefoot into the fire. He paused, then finished, voice no louder than a prayer, that someone is you. Claire stood very still. No music played, no crowd applauded. There was only the wind, the smell of peonies, and the rustle of her sweater sleeve as she reached up to wipe a tear. Her voice was small when she finally spoke. I don't need grand, she whispered, just kind. Andrew smiled. Then we're already there. She nodded once, then again, eyes glassy, lips trembling into a smile that carried all the seasons she'd endured. And as he slid the ring onto her finger, a gust of wind passed through the garden, lifting a few petals into the air. They swirled for a moment, catching the light, then fell softly, like blessings. Claire looked down at her hand, at the way the ring sat so lightly, so without demand, as if it had been waiting for her all along. She leaned her head briefly on Andrew's shoulder. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Behind them, the door to the office creaked open. Someone called their names for cake. Claire turned, looked back at the fairy lights glowing above the garden path, and whispered, "Just a minute." Because this moment wasn't done yet. It had waited long enough. She didn't wear heels on her wedding day. She walked down the aisle just like she walked into her future barefoot, brave and beaming. The sky above the Georgia coastline was brushed in watercolor, soft hues of coral and gold, folding gently into one another like a blessing. Waves rolled in, slow and unhurried, carrying the rhythm of a promise that had taken years to find its voice. A narrow aisle had been marked with wild daisies, each one gathered by hand. No grand arch, no white carpet, just flowers and sand, and the hush of loved ones holding their breath. Claire stood at the edge of it all. Her dress wasn't silk or lace. It was simple cotton, flowing like the tide, catching the breeze as if it too had been waiting for this day. She held no bouquet, wore no veil, only a small silver ring on her finger and the memory of every step that brought her here. Her feet pressed into warm sand, grounding her not in the past, but in the now. She looked ahead. Andrew stood at the end of the aisle, hands clasped, heart visible in the way he smiled without trying to. He didn't blink, didn't breathe. He only saw her. And she began to walk. Not in time with music there was none. Just to the rhythm of her breath, her heartbeat, her truth. Each step was its own story. The night she had walked into a corporate lobby without shoes. The mornings she rose before dawn to care for her mother. The bus rides, the cheap coffee, the whispers behind her back. The garden filled with lights. The moment she was seen, she passed faces she knew. Some had once judged her. Some had doubted. Some had even laughed. But not today. Today. They watched with tears in their eyes. Not because she had become someone else, but because she had become fully herself. She reached Andrew and took his hands. They stood without a minister. They had chosen to speak their vows in their own voices, shaped by the life they'd lived. Andrew went first. "I never thought strength could be so quiet," he said, "but you taught me that love is louder in silence, and that healing doesn't have to be fast to be real." Claire's lips trembled, but she didn't look away. Then it was her turn. "I once came to you with nothing," she said, her voice clear but soft. "But you gave me the space to become someone I could love again." The breeze stilled, as if the world paused, just for a second, to listen. No applause followed, just the ocean, and that was enough. Andrew slid a second ring onto her finger, this one etched with 2 letters now, E and C. The initials didn't just stand for names. They stood for everything that had bloomed between them. Later. As the sun dipped lower and the sand cooled beneath their feet, Claire and Andrew sat alone on a driftwood bench near the shore. The celebration behind them was still warm with laughter and light. But this moment was theirs. Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. "Remember that email I sent you?" she said, her voice like dusk, the one with the coffee stain. He smiled, hard to forget. She turned slightly to look at him, her eyes shining not just with love, but with something more. "I think we should probably start looking at cribs." Andrew blinked. "What?" She smiled wider now, the kind of smile that comes only after years of not knowing if you'd ever smile like that again. "We're going to be 3 soon." His mouth parted slightly, the surprise catching his breath. Then his hand reached for hers gently, instinctively, as if anchoring himself to the joy. "You're serious," he whispered. She nodded. "I found out this morning." He pulled her closer. No big gestures, just a long exhale against her hair, like the wind had finally settled in his lungs. They didn't say much after that, because sometimes the heart speaks best in silence. As night folded over the beach, guests began to leave, laughter echoing softly in the distance. Claire stood once more, bare feet brushing the tide. Her dress fluttered in the wind. The daisies from the aisle scattered, some carried out to sea, some left behind. She looked up at the stars just beginning to appear. She had come barefoot. She had stayed strong, and she had walked into a life she never thought she could have, not because someone saved her, but because someone saw her and stayed. And in the quiet of that final evening, the waves carried away her old fears. One by one, sometimes, the world measures worth by titles, appearance, or how perfectly we fit into a mold. But real strength often walks in quietly barefoot, worn but unbreakable. This story reminds us that dignity doesn't come from having it all together. It comes from showing up, even when everything is falling apart. Claire didn't have the right shoes, the right clothes, or the right connections. What she had was heart, grace, and the quiet courage to keep going when most would have given up. It teaches us that kindness is not weakness, that humility can shine brighter than confidence, and that sometimes the most unqualified people are the ones most equipped to lead with love and humanity. We all carry invisible battles. We all have days when we feel unseen or misunderstood. But even in those moments, our value remains unchanged. So, wherever you are in life, whether you're starting over or simply trying to hold on, remember this. The world needs more people who walk barefoot into hard places and still choose hope. Thank you for taking the time to walk through this story with us. If it touched your heart, made you feel something, or reminded you of your own quiet strength, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Every story we tell is crafted to heal, to inspire, and to remind us that even in our hardest moments, we are never truly alone. Your support means the world. See you in the next story.